we're in this moment surrounded by and defined by what I call before culture technologies, which is to say that the technologies shaping our lives now and shaping cities arrive faster than our cultural understanding of them do. And any form of design practice that meaningfully engages with them therefore needs to move at that pace and needs to get ahead of that. Architecture is this really interesting discipline that sits in between culture and technology. It's one of the few left that is broad enough to encompass classes in philosophy and engineering, now coding and software, as well as collage and watercolor and life drawing. As so many different disciplines become increasingly forms of vocational education, increasingly pragmatic, architecture still seems to exist as this space in between a whole series of things. So as someone that could never really make a decision about what they actually wanted to do with their lives, it seemed like a good way to hedge bets. You could be an artist as well as an engineer and a scientist. And especially today in an increasingly complex world, I think architects are kind of uniquely positioned then to operate in really productive ways because we do span those territories. You're an architect and walk into a bar and have a meaningful conversation with a filmmaker as well as an engineer or a scientist. So we can be translators. And that's always was interesting to me. And one of my great frustrations with the architecture profession, in many ways the reason I left it, was because I think that extraordinary position is to a large extent wasted on what we call quote unquote traditional forms of architecture, which in today's age has become an increasingly marginalized luxury and boutique industry available to only those with capital and power to support us and afford us. The idea of making trophies for despots, icons for the mega rich, doesn't seem like the best use of a set of skills which are so valuable in the age of the polycrisis. Although I'm desperately attracted to and excited by the architectural education, I am very frustrated with the realities of the architecture profession. Architects' roles used to be really instrumental in the way that our cities form and the way that we communicate and exist and relate to each other across space. But what's happened is that increasingly the architect as a figure has been marginalized. To a large extent, the forces that shape cities now are no longer the domain of architects. It once was the the architect who would shape and make physical space and public space in the city, the piazza, the huge forms of fixed permanent public infrastructure, the built environment, to a large extent conditioned who we were and who we were as urban beings. But now we're in a moment where the piazza is being usurped by the platform, and our relationship to the network is much more instrumental in defining who we are than our relationship to the built space around us. So an architecture profession that increasingly defines itself, or solely defines itself as the maker and shaper of buildings as physical objects, ends up becoming a much more marginalized or boutique industry. And meanwhile, the forces shaping cities has kind of moved on. So if someone's interested in affecting change, then it seems to me that there's an essential need to redefine the nature of what an architect does, to update that form of practice to be more meaningfully connected to the real forces of change that exist today. And those forces are, to a large extent, systems and infrastructures of technology. Today, the way that we connect and relate to each other in public space is no longer conditioned by an urbanist or an architect making that space. It's conditioned by a dude in a hoodie and sneakers, setting their own rules for public discourse, deciding what's allowed, what's not allowed, what can be monetized. And architects connecting into that system seem to me to be a way that we could be increasingly relevant. So I moved from traditional forms of practice into being an architect that was increasingly engaged with systems of technology. And what that meant was that we needed to think about new ways that architects and designers could operate at the pace that technology is operating. Architecture is a traditionally incredibly slow medium, whereas technology is coming at us at speeds faster than our cultural capacity to understand what they might mean, operate as. So we needed to develop a new set of skills as designers and architects to cope with that pace. So increasingly speculation becomes a critical practice of a designer and architect, to try and anticipate or imagine consequences of technologies before they actually arrive. Otherwise, we're just standing around in line waiting for the next iPhone to be released. To really play an instrumental role in starting to think about how these technologies are rolled out, how they affect our lives, we need to be operating essentially in the realms of science fiction, imagining the implications of things before they come. So increasingly, that's essentially what I do. I build imaginary worlds, but really what I'm doing is exploring the global, the architectural, the urban implications of emerging technologies, and trying to ask questions about them so that we can arm ourselves with sufficient knowledge in order to know, what of these systems we should be investing in, or regulating, or running away from screaming. When we start to think about the changing face of technology and how technology is changing our lives, when we start to think about what our future looks like, we can look back to the history of mediums like science fiction and mediums like film as being the conduits through which we share and disseminate ideas. Really, these mediums of popular culture, the mediums of fiction, are an extraordinary shared language. They've always been how our culture shares and disseminates ideas. And I'm really interested in co-opting those mediums and thinking about them not just as vehicles for entertainment, to put people in seats to create a backdrop for some superhero moment, but instead I'm interested in the ways that we've always used the sites within film as places in which to prototype new ideas about who we could be, who we might want to be in the future. I think of the landscapes, the imaginary worlds and cities of science fiction as rehearsal spaces where we can play out ideas. Oftentimes science fiction is talked about as a medium of prediction, but really prediction is just a side effect of science fiction. Actually, it's a space in which we test ideas and prototype things, and through that medium we start to develop sufficient knowledge about who we are today and how we might make choices in this present moment. Science fiction is really about offering a way to look back in on who we are today. I use the analogy that the future ahead of us is a dark, shadowed and unknown territory. And every story, every film, every narrative that we might construct or talk about that future through is like a tiny little torch beam illuminating a little slither of that landscape ahead of us. And the more stories we tell, positive, negative, utopian, dystopian, the more of that landscape becomes illuminated. And the easier it is for us to start to think about how we might navigate a path through it, how we might move from one side to the other being some kind of preferable future. My work has become essentially the medium of imaginary worlds. And in those worlds, I'm exploring visions of our future.
나는 서울입니다. 만나서 반가워요. 저는 인공도시 시스템입니다. 네온사인 달빛 아래에 비친 당신의 헤어스타일이 아름답습니다.
A lot of my work, even the speculative work or the science fiction related work, actually all begins in a documentary practice. I'm kind of interested in the quote that's now almost a cliche in the world of futures from William Gibson, the science fiction author, who originally wrote Neuromancer, the novel where the word cyberspace first appeared, one of the fathers of the cyberpunk genre. He has this quote which says that the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And if you were to take that quite literally, it means it must be possible to get on a plane and travel around the world and visit pockets of the future that exist in the present tense. And essentially, the starting point of a lot of my work is doing just that, is going on the ground to kind of ground truth these futures that are already here, to document them, to record them, and to present them to a world that maybe hasn't realized that they exist yet. And really my practice of world building and speculation into these imaginary worlds is a practice of extrapolation and exaggeration. I just take what we might call a weak signal or an emerging trend, the beginnings of the rollout of autonomous vehicles in China, or we might travel to some of the world's largest renewable energy infrastructure as a precursor of the energy transition, and document these moments. And then in my practice, what I'm doing is just scaling them up and imagining what would happen if they became ubiquitous. I'm trying to identify these emerging trends, and then in our stories, in our artwork, we're playing them out and seeing where they end up and putting them in front of people so that we're able to, a more general audience and a public is able to form opinions on whether or not these are futures that we want to be buying into or not. And increasingly what that means is that I end up spread all over the planet because really we're in a moment where the value and the role of national borders has totally eroded. The scales of crises that we might be trying to engage with no longer exist at the scale of nation states. They exist at planetary scales. And the globalised world means that nothing occurs on a single point in a map anymore. So if we're trying to think about a city like London or Copenhagen or Los Angeles, where I'm based now, to really understand its future is not just about sitting in that particular point, but rather it's about visiting all of the contingent landscapes that both are produced by a city like that or produce a city like that. So we end up trying to stitch together a portrait of a place by traveling all over the planet, trying to understand it. To understand where we are in this present moment, being filmed by a set of cameras with slim, vibrating, stacks of rare earth in our pockets it's our window into the world. We might travel all the way back to the rare earth mine in Inner Mongolia where these technologies begin their lives. We travel to Bolivia and the lithium mines where the material that's the key ingredient in all our batteries come from. We might look at the electronic landscapes and manufacturing in Shenzhen where 70-80% of our electronics come from. We might look at the waste landscapes that are produced by the cities that we live in, and the e-waste landscapes of Africa or China. We might look at the political landscapes that shape the regulatory systems. We might look at the energy landscapes that power these cities. To really understand who we are today is a planetary problem. Film is a unique medium that allows us to cut through all that complexity and stitch together these global stories in a way that we can kind of understand them and tell stories about them. And what it means is that, my practice is bridging the local and the planetary, because the only way to understand the local is through the lens of the planetary today.
In the beginning, under a sky heavy with stars, the dreaming was clear and bright. But the sky would soon change, and the future would arrive like a storm. They arrived not to listen to the land, but to tear it open. Our songs became whispers, drowned out by the roar of these new machines. In thunder and dust, the stories were scattered to the winds. They had long ignored the warning signs until the world began to scream. After generations of machines draining out oceans and land, we all came together to declare that they must now draw their last breath. And so the silence of the machines became the heartbeat of the new world. We sliced them apart with flame, and in the sparks amongst the wreckage of the past, we begin to dance.
I really think at this moment, we don't really have any shared visions of what our collective aspirational futures should look like. And I think film plays a critical role in doing that. I really think that the futures we imagine end up becoming the futures that we live in. Especially in this moment, I essentially am a science fiction artist in many ways. I make science fiction worlds, and I play on those genres of science fiction across the ages. I'm very much interested in the history of punks, cyberpunk, solar punk, steampunk, which are all really interesting ways of thinking about the time in which those visions of the future were made. In many ways, these punks are chronicles of the time in which they were made. Something like cyberpunk, produced in the 1980s, at the beginnings of the personal electronic boom, where For the first time, we're walking around with a Sony Walkman, we're running home to press record and our VHS video player, and we get the first glimpses of the world that we now currently occupy. So the science fiction, the visions of the future of the time imagined reactions against that. Hacker communities imagined a hybrid, US, Japan context, because everything cool at the time was made in Japan. And far from being a prediction, it was a way of exercising the various fears and anxieties that we had in that moment, where we saw the rise of these megatech companies coming. We saw the role that these systems might play in our lives. And across the history of science fiction, to a large extent, that's been its role, is to play out those fears and anxieties of the moment. I make an argument now that what we desperately need is a new kind of punk. I say that my work are produced as artifacts of what I describe as a form of planetary punk, which is a genre of science fiction that is designed to meet the challenges of our age. What does it mean to design with planetary systems in mind? To think about large-scale geoengineering, to think about massive planetary energy transitions. What are the visions of the future that we need today in order to herald and bring about that kind of future that is operating at a scale to meet the climate crisis head on? Because to a large extent, the images that we share in contemporary culture that could be classified as hopeful or aspirational visions of a future or utopian images of a future are based in the failed ideals of boomer environmentalism. They're based in a particular idea of 60s and 70s ecological thinking that is just no longer fit for purpose. It just doesn't scale anymore. They're visions that emphasize localism, small-scale individual gestures and actions, recycling, trees on rooftops, community gardens in Brooklyn. And maybe in the 60s and 70s, had we listened, we had a chance. But we've long since blown past any moment where those kinds of visions had a chance of success. And now we desperately need a planetary scaled forms of action. But in popular culture, images of planetary change or projects that work at planetary scales are, for the most part, dystopian. They're the work of the Bond villain or the evil sci-fi megacorporation. So what I do and what I classify my work as is creating new planetary imaginaries, which is to say, I'm trying to create a new aesthetic language for our future that is scaled to the planetary crisis that we call home. And that means that the work is provocative. Sometimes it feels dark. I'm introducing images that don't necessarily coincide with images that we think of as being a hopeful future we're trying to get towards. But if those images feel scary, it's only because we've gotten to a point where the scale of solution is really daunting. So I'm interested in these big, grand projects of planetary change and trying to make work that conditions us for that reality. Because I think science fiction, its role has changed across the years. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, the role of sci-fi was to be a space in which we could imagine wild possibilities. Food in pill form, flying cars, robot butlers, things like that. That was the space where we could come up with crazy things. Now the role of science fiction has shifted, and now what we're doing is essentially creating stories that help us to understand the consequences and possibilities of technologies that are actually already here. That's the necessity of speculative visions of an imaginary world today, is to just try and understand who we are in this moment. Because something like AI is here. There's already billions of dollars invested in it. It's already sitting on our laptops and in our phones. But what it means for us and who we are, who we become in the next 5 or 10 years, we have absolutely no idea about. But the technology is already in motion. There's no stopping it now. So the role of an artist, I think, is to ask those questions and explore those possibilities. And I use the medium of imaginary worlds to do so, to try out those things. My latest film is a work called World Machine, which is trying to visualize what a sustainable version of AI infrastructure might look like. What is a massive AI data center that doesn't steal resources from local communities, but instead creates its own energy systems, its own water networks, and distributes wealth in a way not to 5 billionaires, but to local communities and the indigenous population on which those resources and land is taken. I'm interested in trying to create those new visions of a future that are born out of a pragmatic reality of the world that we've constructed for ourselves today. A lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is trying to think about our relationship to the natural world and what that means going forward. Trying to think about our relationship to forests, to oceans, and to think about the status of what these things are. We have, for the most part, terraformed the Earth and remade it in our own image. We've engineered the planet from the scale of the cell to the tectonic plate. And we essentially exist in what I describe as a planetary scaled city now. There is no part of the planet that isn't conditioned by or conditions the city. We have created conditions where things like oceans are essentially conveyor belts, moving goods back and forth from sites of production to sites of consumption. Landscapes have become resource fields. Countries have become industrialized agriculture or factory floors. Oceans are an extension of factory supply chains. And every part of the planet, even if it appears empty, is somehow contingent upon an urban form or produced by an urban form. So I'm interested in what it means to make work or exist in that moment. We look in on the Earth from outside it and we see this precious and untouched blue marble, and to a large extent that is the image of the Earth that defined the modern ecological movement. But that image of the Earth is no longer valid. It's totally outdated. We have engineered this blue marble. It's now an absolute construction. But we still persist with this idea that technology and nature are somehow separate from each other, and anything that we make is at the expense of the natural world and is in opposition to it. And what I'm interested in doing is looking at this totally constructed condition that we find ourselves in, and to reimagine that image of the blue marble. What would it mean to now start to think about solutions to the crisis that we've created that aren't about this oppositional relationship between nature and technology? I've created a work called The Great Endeavor, which is a film that is a visualization of what I describe as what will become humanity's largest ever construction project, which is the design of a planetary network of carbon removal infrastructure to take 300 years of billowing black smoke out of the atmosphere and store it for eternity, in rock beneath the ocean floor or beneath the sands of the desert. And that is met with a lot of opposition. People talk about, well, why don't we just plant more trees? Why don't we create a forest that, nature has engineered trees as being carbon sinks? And that's certainly true, but at the same time, for generations we could fight to build back the great forests, to capture that carbon for us. And in the space of 4 years, one wrong election in Brazil and some madman can burn it all down in favor of agriculture to try and make a quick buck. And all of that work is lost and all that carbon is back up in the air. So I'm interested in just the pragmatics of geoengineering solutions. And that's why a lot of the visions that I create in my work seem daunting and seem scary, because they're not polite. They're based on a position of extreme pragmatism. I think of my work as existing within the context of the sublime, that historically has been about both an awe and a fear of the power of nature. And the imagery that I kind of create in my films is trying to play on the history of sublime painting. I mean, I use Hollywood visual effects techniques and high-end digital graphics and so on to create the work, but it's trying to connect into that tradition of the sublime. But I think about the concept of the technological sublime in this context. I think that relationship to a nature out of control is instead now those feelings exist in the context of technology to a large extent. Instead of Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer standing on the edge of a cliff looking out across a vast canyon, we stand at the edge of a giant floodlit power plant, with gas plumes illuminating the night sky, turning it into day. That is the condition that gives us that same feeling now. So I'm not sure about whether or not large-scale natural systems, oceans, have that same sense of awe and fear and chaos that they once did. But instead, we stand at the precipice of a hyperscale data center, cooled by rivers stolen from communities, putting into the sky carcinogens, creating new cancer clusters. I think that is the moment, that is the position from which we have those feelings of the sublime again today. So I'm trying to capture that in my work. I've made a project called Planet City, which is a film that is trying to document and explore the idea of a single city for the entire population of the Earth. It's trying to think about what it means to create a city in a sustainable form that's hyperdense, very compact as a means to make space for other species, to return stolen land and give back some territory to the natural. But at the same time, what makes that work is intense vertical farm structures. And I try and create imagery that alludes to the nature documentary, the types of imagery that we used to associate with the natural plains and savannas. I try and use poetic language that we once might have used to describe wandering clouds and daffodils, but instead to describe the buzz of LEDs illuminating the lower reaches of this dense city's farm fields where strawberries are growing underneath blue and red LED light, using very little water resources, no pesticides, because today that is the most, ironically, the most sustainable form of farming. The most organic strawberry on earth is grown in a warehouse in Brooklyn, because it is essentially grown in a clean room environment, which means it doesn't need pesticides. It's grown in a way that is highly managed and targeted, which means you can control the amount of light and the amount of water at the scale of a fruit, as opposed to the scale of a field. But it just doesn't fit into the image of what we think the future of our food should be. And we still have this idea that sustainable farming and food production, that hopeful or utopian futures means getting up at sunrise and working on generational farms and growing our food in the way that we used to, rolling hills and black and white cows under the sunrise. But really at the scale of 8 billion people, or 10 billion as we're headed towards, that form of production just is a total fiction. And it already is a fiction today. Food production has been becoming totally agricultural and it has been becoming totally industrialized already. So I try and create images that help get us ready for this reality and get excited about what it might mean to think about a neighborhood vertical farm. I think to a large extent, the work of an artist or an architect in many ways is to create counter-narratives, to create stories and to put into the world ideas that run counter to the dominant media narratives that were being sold day to day. So to a large extent, there's a really critical role in an aesthetic practice in revealing the invisible, in peeling back the layers of reality and seeing the landscapes and the layers that are actually existing below the surface. If we think about the technologies that are shaping our lives, AI, mobile technologies, social media platforms, whatever it may be, driverless cars, drones, and so on, we need to look beyond the narrative that we're being sold about them. These technologies are being presented to us as things that are going to make our lives better. They're going to connect us better to our families. They're going to give us more free time, make things easier, give us a better orgasm, whatever it may be. what we need to be doing then, if that's the dominant media narrative, is as artists actually complicating that and talking about, yes, well, this life of leisure is actually fueled by extraordinary data capture and the end of privacy. It means that to produce the futures of AI that we're all kind of being a part of means massive planetary infrastructure of energy, data centers, reversing any advances we've made towards climate change in order to power this extraordinary future. We're trying to get people to think about technologies in ways that they actually are operating in the world. Again, dominant media narratives present these systems in forms like, with language like the cloud, the MacBook Air. Like, we use all this language within dominant media narratives that suggests that technology is just of the ether, it's just drifting out in the world, whereas technology is geology. It's literally made of rock and refined minerals. So what does it mean to think about, when you power on your laptop, to think about the energy landscape, the salt flats in Bolivia that is enabling that process? What does it mean to think about the rare earth mineral mine when you slide that slimline phone into your pocket? When we share an engagement ring, made of gold and diamond, it's an heirloom object. It's passed down from generation to generation because we see those materials as being of the earth, timeless and precious. There's nothing less precious about the minerals and the gold and the material in an iPhone. Yet, when our phone contract is up, we throw it away and get the new one. What would it mean for a laptop to be considered an heirloom object? This is my iPhone 7. I've been holding on to it until you're 16. I wanted to keep it for you. My grandmother gave it to me. Now I think it's time to give it to you. What does it mean to create narratives and artwork and worlds that try and change our relationship to these systems? And I think that's the role of what we do as designers and artists, is try and upset the status quo and to complicate our relationship to things, because everything else is mobilized to try and smooth out those relationships.